Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows.
Welcome back everyone. It's been quite a while since I've done a personal stories episode on the podcast, and so I thought it was high time I did another one. I do apologize if I sound a bit kind of nasal on this one. I seem to have picked up a cold along the way, and that's just one of those things, I guess, for the time of year, etc. But I hope this is going to be an interesting version for you, because it's a bit different. Because I wanted to talk about the first time that I actually ended up doing staff work and being on the ground, which as a pilot is always one of those things that you kind of dread initially. But as it turned out for me, it was actually, really opened my eyes and gave me some great opportunities that I hadn't really foreseen. I'd been incredibly lucky. I had spent 14 years flying from the time I'd come out of officer training, gone through flying training, and then all my time in Germany, and then time at Coltishall as a flight commander. By the time I actually ended up with the Grand Tour, I couldn't have gone any further and progressed up the career ladder without doing a Grand Tour. And therefore it was kind of high time, and they caught up with me in the end. And Grand Tours are definitely not one of those things that aircrew look forward to, I think, but they're not all created equal. And I was incredibly lucky. I went to the Ministry of Defence for my first one as a squadron leader, and I went into a role called Air Offensive 8, which was in the Directorate of Air Offensive at the time. Doesn't exist now, different structures and so on these days. But I was looking after the Jaguar, which obviously I'd spent all my time flying up to then in terms of operational flying, and was working with the wing commander. We, with the two of us together, were the Jaguar office in the MOD. And it was a completely different world, I have to say, when I first got there, because I guess I didn't really know what to expect when I first arrived. I had some idea from talking to people who'd done those kind of jobs before, but it was not something that I'd given a huge amount of thought to, and therefore when I rolled up for the first day at the MOD, it was a little bit of a kind of first day at school moment for sure, because first of all, there's the commuting thing. I was not living in central London, where the MOD obviously is, and was living out in a married quarter out in West Byfleet, out in West London near Woking. So jumping on the train and being a commuter for the first time in my life was a bit of a culture shock, and I actually got pretty used to that fairly quickly, as we all did in those days, and everyone was going in and out of the office. Not so much now, obviously, but that was a kind of the first thing to get used to, I suppose, and arriving into Waterloo Station, and then getting very used to the walk across the river to go and find the MOD. And one of the things that people had said to me in the past was, you actually meet and see the same people on the train every day, and lo and behold, that's absolutely true. We did have a little gang of us that we saw very regularly all the time, because we all tended to get the same trains in, certainly, and sometimes out as well of London. So that was one of the first things to kind of get used to. But the bigger one was the MOD environment itself. I mean, I'd gone from being a flight commander on a squadron, and ultimately the deputy boss of the squadron that I was on number 54 squadron, to then going into the MOD as a squadron leader, where I was pretty much completely at the bottom of the food chain. And so you've gone from being quite a big fish in a relatively small pond to being a tiny little fish in really quite a big pond. Because there are a lot of people working in the MOD, obviously from all three services and civil servants. So it was a completely different world in terms of who you were exposed to, how that all fitted together. And of course, we wore suits. We didn't wear uniforms. So the next challenge was who's who, and trying to identify, in a very hierarchical world that the military certainly was in those days, and to a large extent still is now. Then recognizing who was kind of senior to you, and therefore who needed appropriately more deference, etc., was another challenge that had to be undertaken. And the challenges didn't stop there, because these were the days when we still were relatively new to email and computers and things like that. And the MOD had in those days a system called CHOTS, which was the Corporate Headquarters Office Technology System. Now, anybody that's ever read anything about public sector information technology systems will know that it's not a story that usually is happy. And SHOTS was exactly one of those. It was an incredibly challenging system to use, very clunky. When you compare it to modern day PCs and Macs, etc., then it was really very challenging to just manage sending email and certainly producing documents, and particularly where you're working in a world where you have to work at different security classification levels. That was incredibly difficult to navigate. And so getting used to that and having a kind of decent eye on the process that was going to make it easy to do your job was doubly difficult. And we weren't entirely electronic. We were still firmly in a world of hard copy files and registries. So we had staff in the registry who looked after all our files and our filing, and everything you produced was basically printed out, kept on hard copy file. And therefore, if you were looking back for anything, you found it on the file. You didn't go and dig around in an electronic archive for it. There's some pluses and minuses to that, because it did mean you could actually find stuff, because by and large it had been filed and there was a pretty good audit trail, and you could go back and find what was there. And I think we see that now, where you see the sort of 30-year release of classified information and so on and so forth, that pretty rapidly we're going to get to a stage where we're now into the electronic world. And that's going to become more challenging, because I think some of the stuff in terms of the discipline around the filing of documents and so on is different now, or was certainly different back then. And that could mean that there is a bit less ease with which you're going to navigate certainly some of those records. Indeed, are all the records there and in the right order, and is everything as seamless as it really should be. So that was certainly another difference that required getting used to. And we also had a world of prioritization on documents that took some getting used to as well, because we had red tags on files and green tags on files and no tags. So you get stuff that would appear in the in tray, and if it was no tag on it, that's fine. It was just a piece of routine business. If it had a green tag on it, it was urgent. It needed, or important, and needed looking at as soon as possible. If it had a red tag on it, it was extremely urgent and required hand carry, take it round as soon as you've done it, go to wherever the next destination is, and it needed to be done as a priority. And of course, one of the traits that people had, and maybe still have in this world, is artificially inflating the urgency of documents. Because the reality was, a lot of the stuff wasn't that urgent, to be honest. We were dealing with major policy issues a lot of the time, and significant upgrade work, and I'll come to that in a second. But it wasn't the sort of thing that generally required absolute immediacy. Some of the operational work did a bit more, for sure. And we were obviously still doing operations at that stage in terms of the no-fly zones and so on. So there was activity happening over Iraq and over Bosnia that required us to pay attention to it. But the most ironic one I can still remember was having gone out to lunch with my wing commander and coming back in the afternoon and finding a red tag file had been put on the desk. The master key unlocked the office and put a file on the desk with a red tag on it that required immediate response by 4:00 today. And the title of that document was A Vision of the Royal Air Force in 2025. And bear in mind, this was in 1995. That was fairly ludicrous in terms of an immediate requirement. And clearly the tactic being employed by people at that stage was, right, if I give you this really immediate tag, you're not going to have time to read all the paperwork that's in here and the documentation that's gone before. So hopefully you're not going to make too much comment and too much fuss about the content of the paper that's there, because you haven't really got time to absorb it and provide some real proper critique. So needless to say, one of the tactics that I quickly learned from those that I was working around who'd been there a little bit longer and were more worldly wise in this was actually some of the time, you needed to make judgment calls on these things and just decide, is it really that important? Or if we actually just sit there and put it in the pending tray for a day and think about it, will it actually make a big difference? And lo and behold, often that was the case. And certainly getting a sense of how you managed the really urgent and sifted the really urgent from the simply important, or indeed the normally routine, was one of the things that definitely required some time in the role to get used to it. It was a great team that we had there, though, and despite the kind of dreaded Grand Tour thing that was out there, and everyone was thinking, "Oh, what's this actually going to be like?" I loved my time in the MOD. I had a really interesting time. It was helped enormously by the fact that one of the things that was happening was we were doing a big upgrade to the Jaguar's capability. We were looking at a significant avionic and weapon enhancement upgrades to the aeroplane. And without going into too much boring detail here, we had found a way to do this that was completely different to the way it had been done previously through BAE Systems as it is now, or British Aerospace as it was then, and avoided an awful lot of the bureaucracy. We went through the Defence Research Agency, fast-tracked the development and the implementation of a sort of a spiral development upgrade, I suppose you'd describe it as now, to get tremendous increases in capability at not only very low cost, but also with incredible speed compared to the process that had hitherto been the case. And that was a really fascinating thing to be part of, because not least I was in the Jaguar office, but clearly there was a Harrier office and there was a Tornado office, and every other type of aeroplane had an office who were doing similar stuff to us. And I can vividly remember some of the conversations where the Tornado, for example, still a relatively new aeroplane at that stage, but having to have its capability developed quite a lot. And they were immensely frustrated that we were able to turn around and move forward with real speed and real agility in terms of the kit we were putting in the aeroplane and the difference we were making. And of course, when we're then hearing from the front line how that was going, and we were linked very closely to them to make sure that we were delivering stuff that they wanted and providing kind of proper input when we chose pieces of equipment and so on. We were ensuring that we took pilots along to the meeting who were actually on the front line still, and made sure that they were going to get what they needed. That was really, really satisfying work. And so as Grand Tours went, it was most definitely one of the things that brightened the day was seeing success, because quite often that wasn't the case. There's plenty of people I know who have been in Grand Tours, and indeed it's happened to me a little bit in subsequent ones, where success was not having your program cancelled really, and making sure that you inch stuff forward in a way that continued to have some semblance of progress without really feeling that you ever made an enormous difference. We were in a space of only a couple of years making very significant strides into improving the aeroplane in a way that was enormously rewarding, no question about it. And I'll never forget it, to be honest, as to how we did that. And some of the meetings, some of the travel, because we actually went and bought bits of kit from all over the place. And I went to Israel, I went to America, I did a bunch of different things to look at options that we had to procure kind of the best bits of kit we could get for the aeroplane, and things that nobody else had at that stage: helmet-mounted sights and digital mission planning systems and the like, which were complete novelties. And we did really transform the capability of the aeroplane as the MOD end of a much bigger team that started pulling all that together, and that was again just fun, really, really good fun. Interestingly, though, and from a leadership point of view, when you look more broadly at kind of the stuff I try and do on the podcast here, I think there were some really useful things to hoist aboard. And one of the ones I vividly remember, and I've used it to this day, is the first boss that I worked for, a chap called Mike Gordon in the Jaguar office, who was a Gulf War veteran. He had a Distinguished Flying Cross in the Gulf War, was an absolutely fantastic chap, really, really lovely guy. And he said to me very early on, he said, "Bob, what you need to do is you need to get yourself in a routine here. You need to be arriving at a particular time and leaving at a particular time that suits you for your commute. And everyone else needs to get used to what you're doing in terms of time. Because if you start making those hours much longer, you're either arriving really early or you're leaving really late, or worse still, you're doing both, then pretty quickly people will start to expect you to do that. And when you're not doing it, they're going to be disappointed that you weren't there at 7 o'clock at night, when actually you should have been, quite rightly at that point, back at home and seeing your family." So I did that. I took that advice, and I think it was great advice, because it really does make a difference in terms of ensuring that you do establish a proper balance between what you're doing with your work life and what you're doing with your family life. And I say it a lot these days that I think it's very easy to get things dramatically wrong in that space and spend much too much time at work and much too little time actually doing anything that resembles paying attention to your home life. And I'm certainly not perfect these days, and I know if my wife was commenting on this, she'd be absolutely saying that. But I think I get it. I understand the importance of it at least, and I don't think that's necessarily the case in a lot of corporate sectors either, where people do get overly obsessed with work. They get focused on this has got to be done tomorrow. It cannot possibly wait. And the reality, of course, in the commercial setting as well, is that there's never really the case when lives are going to be lost as a result of you not getting a report written in time or not getting a proposal across the line or whatever. Then I'm not suggesting it's not important to hit deadlines, and it's not important to meet particularly deadlines associated with procurement contracts and proposals, et cetera. But some of the time, it is really important to review what's urgent and what's important, and have some kind of balance around that, and make sure that you're not overly weighting the scales on the work side and not enough on the family and friends side, because ultimately you need both. You need to be in balance with both sides of that relationship to have a kind of happy and fulfilled life. And I think that's a really, really important thing to remember. If you don't do that, then the risk you run is ultimately that you get one or other badly out of balance, and you can potentially manage that for a while if one is okay. If work's going all right and the home life is a bit challenging, then that will help you get through the challenging side on the home life. Conversely, if the home life is going brilliantly and you're really happy and the work life is not so great, then again the home life will pull you through that. But I think where both go wrong, then that's where you need to really pay attention, because you need to worry a lot at that point that this is not going to lead you to a great place. You need to firmly be having an eye on making sure that they do stay on the track and keeping moving forward in the right kind of direction. And if you don't do that, then there'll be trouble ahead, as it were. So that was a really important lesson for me in that role, and I as I say, I took it forward to pretty much everything I did subsequently. It was an amazing tour. I did 2 years in that role in the MOD, pretty much exactly, and I was then off to Staff College. I'd been selected very early on to go to the Staff College, which was the next kind of major hurdle in terms of career progression and movement forward. As a senior officer, everyone that is going to continue on the career path has to do that. And I was actually offered Staff College in either Spain or in Canada, and it was one of the real forks in the road moments for me that I had to actively consider, because when I went on my exchange tour that I talked about previously with the German Air Force, my then wife, we're not together now. We split back in 1999, and I subsequently got remarried later on again in 2006. But my first wife had left the Air Force to go with me to Bremgarten on my exchange tour with the Luftwaffe, and given up her own career in order to do it. And now I'm being offered a job in Canada or Spain for a year to go and do the Staff College course. And she was, having left the Air Force, she was now in a role out in civilian life that she was enjoying and was quite successful and so on. And I just couldn't put her through that again. So I went back to the system and I said, look, is there another option here? I really don't want to be in a situation where for the second time in a row, I'm asking my wife to leave her employment. And they came up with, yeah, okay, fine, I understand that. And unusually in some ways for the system in its time, they were quite sympathetic. And I got a place at the Joint Service Defence College at the Royal Naval College, Greenwich, which was a joint course. So it was an Army, Navy, Air Force course. It was shorter. It was only 6 months instead of a year, and was widely renowned as a really, really good course to do. And because we were in the process of creating a brand new Joint Service Defence College arrangement, which exists now down at Shrivenham and has progressed to there through a new build program and so on, then the course I was on in 1997 at Greenwich was the last of the Joint Service Defence College courses. And that was absolutely stunning to be in that position. I was very privileged to have 6 months there in a fabulous setting. I mean, the Royal Naval College is an outstanding place, and eating 3 meals a day in the painted hall there was just extraordinary, because you got so blasé about the amazing environment you were in and the incredible history of the buildings. You didn't really pay attention to it enough once you'd been there for a little bit of time. But It was absolutely fabulous to be part of it, and a great crowd that I was with as well. It was an entirely British national course, whereas the other staff college courses were all very multinational. We had quite a lot of foreigners on them, and therefore the security classification that you could work at was obviously reduced significantly, whereas our course worked to very high-level security classification. So we had some amazing presentations and some amazing visits to some really, really interesting aspects of defense. And as a mind-broadening, mind-stretching exercise, it was just outstanding. And it was the first time properly for me beyond Cranwell where I really reflected on how good the services are at leadership development and training and giving you opportunities to really, really thrive in that space. Because 6 months on a dedicated course, I mean, almost no commercial organization does that. And I can understand why. I mean, from an opportunity and a fiscal costs issue, it's clearly a huge challenge. But it was absolutely stunning to have that opportunity to be able to go and do as much as we did. And some of the friends I have from there, I still have to this day. You know, there was an outstanding crowd that we were with. At the end of that, I didn't get back to flying. I was still sitting. I had to pay the piper now for my 14 years I'd had before. So I went back into the MOD. Actually, I went to a role where it was very different to the previous one. I was now in the director of operational requirements. So and the air side of that, looking after a thing called the Future Offensive Air System, which was destined to be, in those days, the Tornado replacement. So a long time in the future from where we were. Bear in mind that the Tornado was still, at that stage, a relatively new aeroplane. It was still, obviously, by that stage, probably a bit more than 10 years of service and had been around for a while, doing a lot of stuff. But there was already, and always is, a view to what's the future look like? What are we going to have next? And Future Offensive Air System, FOAS, as it was known, was a really interesting program to be on because, of course, it was looking at cutting-edge technology way out in the future and trying to predict what the threat environment would look like, what technologies were going to be available, and how we were going to integrate those, and looking at, obviously, as well as the actual kind of mechanical side of that, is the costing side of it as well, and working out what we could afford, how we could plan that, how we could budget for what we were actually going to need. And so again, that was a really, really steep learning curve, but a great role to be in, where it was fascinating, totally different to the Jaguar staff job I'd had only less than a year previously, where actually I was in a position of making enormous progress in very short space of time. This was inching forward and doing work that was obviously not going to bear fruit for a couple of decades from where we were then. And that was quite challenging to have have that different kind of level of satisfaction and the challenge that went with building something and working on something that you knew that it was many successors worth of you in that role that were ultimately going to be in a position of maybe seeing this program to fruition. And of course, if you cast the view forward, we're pretty much now, as I record this, in the time frame where that aeroplane would have come into being as something if we were actually going to do that. And of course, it hasn't. It doesn't exist. There is no Future Offensive Air System in the same sense as we were designing it. There is now a new program looking again at the replacement for Typhoon and arguably also for the F-35 in the fullness of time with Project Tempest that is being worked on. But that's completely different to the program that I was working on. So it does show, again, this challenge that I was mentioning earlier on, that for an awful lot of people, success was not having your program cancelled. It wasn't cancelled in my time, but downstream it certainly was. And that was, I guess, was already a view that we potentially had, even way back there in 1997. One of the other interesting challenges in that role, I had some sort of slightly broader responsibilities, one of which was looking at the future carrier-borne aircraft, which even in those days was earmarked as basically being the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, which is now obviously in RAF service and Royal Naval service, flying off off HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, and clearly a number of other countries have got the aircraft as well. And it was absolutely fascinating to be working on a program that was properly joint, because this was clearly very focused around it being naval-led by virtue of the fact it was going to go on a carrier, but was also obviously involving a lot of Air Force expertise as well. And I guess, again, it was a sort of good mind stretch for me to be in that role where I was starting to spread my wings a little bit, I suppose, in terms of understanding the way the other services worked, good, bad, and ugly of all of that, and getting a really kind of proper view under the bonnet of the way some of these challenging programs are developed. Because there is no doubt that it is hard work to work at that level in the ministry, where there's a limited budget and you're all fighting for the same or a slice of the same pie, and trying to make sure your slice is as big as it needs to be, or the biggest you can get realistically, and knowing that that's obviously what's happening from the other two services as well. And the constant challenge is trying to make sure that you're just not undermined in doing that, and you don't shoot yourself in the foot really, and shoot the other services in the foot too, because at the end of the day we should and could be better than that, and recognize that we're all in it together. And that's a really important aspect again that I think I learned for many of my future roles, wind the clock forward a long time from there, where I did a lot more joint work at the back end of my time. I was very focused on the value of being in those tri-service programs rather than having too much single service short-sightedness, which I think was a constant risk, certainly in those days. So that was kind of the first foray for me into the world of staff duties, and living in a suit in the MOD, and a bit of a 6-month opportunity at the Staff College in Greenwich, which was fabulous, and I really, really relished all three of those roles. Were tremendous fun. And at that point, it was, right, what next? Where am I going next? I was on the cusp of being promoted to wing commander. I actually was run for a role that would have taken me into the assessment staff in the cabinet office in the UK government, working at the top level of intelligence and producing assessment documentation for fused intelligence that goes all the way up to the National Security Council as it is now. And it was the first interview I'd had for a role for a very long time, and that was really interesting because I just wasn't kind of thinking about interviews at all, and maybe it showed because I didn't get the job, which I don't really regret because I don't think it would have been my bag. Looking back on it now, it was an opportunity to go and do a role that looked pretty exciting and was undoubtedly quite interesting, but was more probably analytical than my brain normally would have wanted, and I'm quite pleased in hindsight that I didn't get it. And so that falls to one side. It's what next then? Where do I go next? And actually that opened up another opportunity to then go and do an operational deployment on the ground, which I'll talk about in a different podcast, because I think that took me back into the world of operations and back towards the next stage of my flying career. So it was another chapter closed at this point by finishing off those 2 staff jobs and the Staff College role, and some interesting reflections when I look back on it now around some of the things I learned from it on the leadership front. And I hope that's been of interest. And as ever, I really welcome your feedback. So please do let me know what you think, and I will speak to you again very soon. Bye for now.